Excellent. Hey, thanks everybody. I hope everybody can hear me. Thanks to Eric and Fluxology team for putting two people with, I'm not sure we are expert, we are veterinarians with opinions, and everybody has an opinion when it comes to this field, no doubt about it. We like to share our experience. We also like to share maybe a little bit of science behind it. And, remember that this is a very dynamic field, the one is Strep equi, a lot of question raised, a lot of unanswered question, and a lot of protocols that are not perfect, but seem to be working. And, there are expert and research group in this country and worldwide that are doing a phenomenal job. I'm excited to have Dr. Keen here because he has organized, I believe, 2 Habemeyer workshop on Strep equi. So he has a lot of information that is behind the scene, information that maybe has never been published, information has been shared, and I'm excited to actually start this if I can get my computer to work. So what we have decided with Dr. Keen is to team tag. We have chosen 4 topics. Dr. Keen will talking about biological sample, choice of biological sample when it's adequate, what to use and how to collect it. And also be talking about management of outbreaks. And I'll get to talk on areas that I feel comfortable with, clinical presentation, as well as the sometimes a bit controversial diagnostics. So that what we plan to do is give you 1 or 2 slides intro just to set the stage, then open it up for question. So we'll be monitoring that Q&A session here so that we can then start the discussion on the various topics and the various questions that you may have. So let me start, give you a little bit of background clinical presentation. You all have seen it. So the textbook presentation, as you can see from these slides, is a young animal that starts with a little bit of fever, and the fever is followed up with initially serious and then more pronounced mucopurulent bilateral nasal discharge. And as the disease progresses, some of these animals get relatively sick and fairly sick with lethargy and anorexia. One of the characteristics of this condition, strangle, is, especially in these young horses, is the formation and the swelling of the lymph node, which then ends draining. That generally characterizes it and differentiates it from viral condition. The incubation period is generally longer too, if you want to compare that to a viral disease. The interesting part, as our group here in Davis is involved with Merck's biosurveillance program, we get to gather a lot of information on animals with acute onset of fever and respiratory signs. And what we find when it comes to strangle is that age and immune status determines the disease severity. So while the clinical signs that are listed here apply to strangles, the severity of the disease is individual and depend on many factors. Age, so the host plays a role, age, a naive horse versus a horse that has previously seen Strep equi, but it also depends to some extent on infectious status. As these horses develop these pharyngitis, they often have cough associated with it, dysphagia, extended head and neck, as you can see from the lower left picture. If the retropharyngeal lymph node get swollen enough, they restrict the airways. And one condition that I generally look at as a more complicated, as a complication of strangle will be the infection of guttural pouches. I'm assuming, although correct me if I'm wrong, that every single horse will have at some point guttural pouches that are colonized by Strep equi. That doesn't mean that every single horse will develop empyema. You got to have either a drainage issue, a colonization, or a drainage of the retropharyngeal lymph node for a horse to have guttural pouch empyema, with then the risk of developing chondrites and then down the road becoming an animal that may be becoming a silent shedder for extended period of time. While I would say the majority of the cases follow a predictable pattern of upper airway infection and stays with that, there is a certain percentage, and that numbers varies depending on the literature, somewhere between 10 and 20% of the horses that develop sometimes life-threatening complication. And I like to divide them in 2 set. One is metastatic infection. So we're going from local infection to spread to a variety of organ system. And anything that, can be reached through, through the bloodstream can become affected. I would say the majority of the one that we see would be internal infection, lung, liver, kidney. And occasionally we see, the more rare CNS, meningitis, and so on. The other set of complication are the immune-mediated processes where there is either an overreaction of the system, immunological reaction, arthritis type 2 reaction that develops itself into a systemic vasculopathy known as purpura hemorrhagica. We see myopathy, we see cardiomyopathies, we also see an effect on the urogenital apparatus. So glomerulonephritis will be one of the complications. So a little bit of an overview on clinical presentation.
We don't seem to have any questions yet in the chat. Could you talk a little bit, Nicola, about other rule outs, especially these atypical presentations that don't look and smell and everything like typical strangles that could be confused with a strep equi diagnosis?
So I think, well, it depends on what you're looking at, but we're looking at, upper airway infection. That's why I group them. Acute onset of respiratory sign with fever. I would say any viral disease, especially in the early stages, until you have lymphadenopathy and draining of the lymph node, could be a lookalike. So that's why, when it comes to diagnostic, and I know I'm not supposed to talk about that, but, we always look for convenience. I mean, I rarely have a sample that comes to the laboratory where the veterinarian looks at the horse and says, it is strangled. I only want to rule out strangle, especially in the early stages when you haven't diagnosed Strep equi as the underlying cause for the outbreak. You want to throw that net as far as possible and catch as many or screen as many pathogens as possible. So having a capability to screen for respiratory pathogen on top of Strep equi is, in my opinion, advantageous. Where I see a challenge is when you're dealing with older horses. So I'm looking at adult horses that either have previously experienced Strep equi natural infection or have been vaccinated. The clinical disease is mild. So you may have a horse with only fever and nasal discharge, a little bit of cough. Not necessarily that, typical lymphadenopathy with draining lymph node. And that becomes a little bit harder then to figure out, well, is this Strep equi? Should we only be screening for Strep equi? So that's maybe what you're looking at atypical. When it comes to Strep zoo, I think that we're struggling both ways. Is it overdiagnosed or is it underdiagnosed? Unfortunately, Strep zoo, with the technology that we have in detecting the pathogen, either through culture or PCR, doesn't tell us if we're dealing with a virulent clone. So looking at a Strep zoo in the upper airway, in nasal secretion, any kind of respiratory secretion, other than a treacle wash, if you suspect pneumonia, is, in my opinion, pointless because 60% of healthy horses will have Strep zoo as an ubiquitous pathogen in the upper airways. Now, if you can find Strep zoo in a draining lymph node, if you can find Strep zoo in the glottal pouch of a horse that is displaying glottal pouch empyema, and you have ruled out Strep equi, I would say you have enough evidence to call it the culprit. But beyond these, individual condition, I would be hard pressed to call, Strep zoo as a culprit of an upper airway catarrh in a horse for which nasal secretion have been submitted to the laboratory.
Great, thank you for that. And we did have one question, but how often are there lifelong complications especially for younger performance prospects after surviving strangles?
Lifelong, boy, I mean, I don't have any stats here. I'm just thinking about, the majority of the condition that we see if we're looking at immune-mediated condition, they are all reversible. Purpura hemorrhagica, if treated accordingly, I mean, there's always a small percentage of horses that will just not make it. The fatality rate is relatively low. If you look at recent literature, fatality rate is very low, less than 1%. However, if you look at long-term complication, any immune-mediated diseases, so if it's a myocarditis, I think that this horse will have some performance issue. If it's a myopathy, depending on which myopathy it is, the horse may actually be able to recover its muscle mass. If you're dealing with organ-related condition, liver abscess, internal abdominal abscess, and you're treating appropriately, the horse will resolve that condition. So I wouldn't necessarily put, I would say it's a low percentage of horses, young horses, that experience strangles that will end with lifelong issue that will reduce their, let's say, performance or use. Now, if you look at what is the percentage of horses that develop complication, although I have no data to support that, and I'm going to deny that I said it if I'm wrong, just kidding on that one, but I would say I would expect complication at a greater frequency in older horses, so in adult horses versus youngster. The cases that we see with internal infection, cases that we see with immune-mediated, diseases are generally adult horses. They're not the horse that experienced that condition first time, that naive horse experiences. I generally think that these naive horses, most of them do overcome the infection. Now, the disease severity, how sick they're gonna get, may be variable from horse to horse. I don't know if that's your experience, Rob.
Yep. No. That's right on for what my experiences have been. I think that's it for the questions. I don't know how we're doing time-wise. Do we want to move on, or?
This is a perfect time to move on.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I'll be your clicker.
Awesome. Well, thanks a million for joining us this evening. And my kind of somebody had asked a question about notes, and it was answered by the Flexergy team. But I'll tell you this consensus statement. I believe this was the second one. The earlier one was in the late 2000s, if I remember right. But this is what my fallback is. This is a great document. I mean, you can either love or hate these consensus statements that the ACVIM puts out, because as Dr. Pasterla said, everybody's got an opinion. But this is a great attempt to try to get all the information on this disease, from biosecurity to a lot of the research has been done across the world. The group in the UK and in the EU has done a lot of work with this organism. And this group gets together, and it's a big part of the group that I've been involved with the Havemeyer Foundation. But whenever, and it's interesting, today I found a typo in it, and I probably read this thing, no lie, 100 different times, and I found a new typo. So it always has information that can be very relevant. And whenever you're dealing with a situation with strep, it can be very helpful in communicating with clients too, because and as we'll talk about in the last section, when we talk about dealing with outbreaks, I mean, everybody's freaked out, and we've got to keep our wits about ourselves when we approach this situation. Very easily obtained, just strep consensus statement will come right up. You don't have to pay to get it, and it's a fantastic resource. So if you want to move on to the next slide, please. And this is really my only slide on the sampling. And as I sort of alluded to, the situation with these outbreaks and the quarantine possibilities, and state veterinarians, and everybody's sort of freaking out. And a lot of times we don't do ourselves any favors by what the kind of samples that we're trying to obtain. And so what are you trying to accomplish? I mean, is this a situation where you are the third veterinarian that has shown up and the two previous veterinarians didn't tell the client what they wanted to hear? And so you're dealing with this outbreak at the end, or you're in the middle, or is it early on? And so you sort of have to sort of keep that in mind. The big thing, and one of the cool things about this particular disease, is we do have a break or a holiday, if you will, in the first 24 to 48 hours, because Strep equi does not colonize the upper respiratory tract. If they get exposed to it, it goes through the tonsil in short order. And some of the work John Timoney did, challenging horses and then coming back just a few hours later, he couldn't culture Strep equi out of the upper airway of these horses that he challenged a few hours before. And so it does take time for horses to shed this organism in the environment. And, you know, the big thing is, and that's when we come to managing these outbreaks, you know, if a horse develops a fever, it's going to take a little time for that organism to be able to be detected on mucous membranes. And so it's really something to think about when you're dealing with it. Don't discount if it looks like that's what you're dealing with. You know, sit tight. If you're very early on, you may miss it and ended up going in another direction. So sort of keep that in mind. So you can take an aspirate, you know, if you've got a nice, ripe, ready to burst abscess, you can take an aspirate of that. You're going to get a high level of bacterial organisms and you're going to be able to get your diagnosis, but they have to be in that particular stage of disease. Nasal swabs. You know, there was some work done with these flock swabs that are more expensive versus cotton versus Dacron or nylon. Nasal swabs are simple. You're just swabbing the rostral part of the respiratory tract. And so you sort of have to keep that in mind. You know, it's all about sampling the largest, and especially when we're talking about trying to identify horses that intermittently shed this organism in the environment, the more surface area we can sample, the better. And that's where the nasal pharyngeal wash, it comes into play. And it can be a little intimidating. That picture, if I remember right, that's Dr. Jeff Cook in Lexington. You know, the neat thing about the nasal pharyngeal washes, they're pretty easy. You can use a lip chain. When you're talking about these very sensitive diagnostics, cross contamination is a huge problem. You've got to really keep that in mind, and you can use a lot of disposable equipment, catheters, disposable foam cup or solo cup, and you can do a better job if you're sampling multiple animals in one day to try to be sure you don't have any cross contamination. And we're going to talk a lot about the guttural pouch washes. I had an epiphany about 20 years ago, and I'll show you the slides that gave me my epiphany. It is truly, when we're talking about trying to eliminate this organism from endemic premises, it's truly all about the guttural pouch. And it's a bugger if you don't have a suck scope. And, you know, but that is what we need to focus on if we want to try to eliminate this organism from the population. So the big thing to remember on sampling is your timing is very important. Remember, you're going to get some false negatives early on, and certainly getting a really good history, and we'll talk about that when we talk about dealing with outbreaks, is very, very important. So that's pretty much the sampling discussion. Some people, there's a veterinarian that presented something kind of interesting using a Swiffer to sample water tanks. I think common water sources are probably the most important part to be eliminated. And it was kind of interesting. He developed, similar to some of the salmonella sampling thing, a sort of a protocol for being able to sample common water sources to try to figure out, you know, do you have a heavy bioburden that is exposing horse populations to this organism, Strep equi. So that's all I had on the sampling. Pretty straightforward.
So I would encourage a participant to ask a question. Otherwise, it's going to be a very boring dialogue here between Rob and myself. But I have a question, because, you know, there's always this dilemma: practicality versus science-driven way. for some diseases, that's the case. So if I see, can you remind which biological sample you as a practitioner, you have a lot of practical experience. I'm an academician, so I'm living in scientific outer world. We do things that, most of the people cannot do. But as a practitioner, what biological sample should you consider based on the disease form? With disease form, I'm looking at that youngster with fever and snotty nose versus that horse that maybe had strangles 3 weeks ago, now is clean as a whistle, but you just want to be sure that this horse isn't shedding and representing a risk to other horses.
Yeah, I mean, the big thing is if you've early on in the disease, doing an aspirate or doing a nasal swab or swabbing an open draining lymph node is probably the best plan. I really think, I know people are very intimidated by the nasal pharyngeal wash, but once you get the hang of it, you can wash a pile of horses in a short period of time, and you're doing the best job. And remember, you're not going to be one and done. If you just do the wash, you're going to have to follow up to confirm that, the consensus statement talks about 3 negative samples. Very tough to do, very expensive to do. But the more surface area, especially if we're trying to determine whether a horse is intermittently shedding the organism from the guttural pouch, that nasal pharyngeal wash is really easy to do, and it's easy to keep yourself golden as far as not getting cross contamination. And so that would be my 2 sort of comments on that.
And how do you exactly do that wash?
Yeah, basically, a lip chain, it works the best because they're easier to disinfect between horses, and you can have 2 lip chains while the other one's, being disinfected. And basically, you're going to take, 50 cc's of body temperature saline in a Foley catheter, any sort of catheter you can get up in the nose, and I think it's pretty important that you see drainage out of both nostrils. And if you don't, you probably ought to wash the other side again, just to be sure you have. But remember, and the one thing that, if in fact you've got one of these weird horses that may have something in a sinus, which is very rare, you're going to pick that up through the nasal passages, and any sort of intermittent shedding from the guttural pouch, you'll pick up that way. And you collect it in a styrofoam cup is what a lot of people will do, because those are cheap and you can throw them away. Put them in a centrifuge tube, and then normally what is done is you submit the pellet, or pour off the supernate after you've centrifuged it, and for PCR analysis. And that's a really good way to assay a bunch of animals in a short period of time, and again, not deal with it, not have a scope to has to disinfect and that type of thing. So in a real practical way, I think that's the best way to do it.
So the important part, if I understand you right, is disposable equipment because of carryover and cross-contamination. I just want to add, it's just one thought. I've been involved with outbreak when we do collect a lot of sample, and one of my biggest worry is these horses have a tendency to sneeze, and they'll contaminate the entire field, especially if you get close to that to the nasopharynx. And so we've been using 1 gallon Ziploc bags. So instead of putting the cup and trying to retrieve it, we put the Ziploc bag in front of the nares before we even deflate the 50 cc saline, and that way when the horse decides to snort, I feel it's contained within.
Good idea.
But again, the washes are more reliable, but greater risk to aerosolize, at least droplet aerosolize these the pathogen.
Yeah,
So there's another question here from Dr. Christensen. When is the best timing to retrieve a sample post fever? So you said, the first 1 or 2 days you got fever, potentially no pathogen in the upper airways. So when would you, and how would you address that clinical approach in a case like that?
Yeah, you would expect a couple of the days that you're going to have shedding of the organism, and obviously, if you've got a draining lymph node or something like that, it's going to be positive. You're going to be successful. It's just these cases that, you know, you've got pain on palpation of lymph nodes, they've got a fever, and, you know, don't really know if they're shedding the organism yet. So that would be how I would figure that part of it out.
Is, in your opinion, in a case like this, where you have these, you know, lukewarm signs, early stage, is a deeper biological sample better than a nasal swab? So in other words, a nasopharyngeal swab or wash would be more indicated than a nasal swab or nasal wash?
More surface area, the better,
Oh,
you
yeah.
know, at all stages would be my knee jerk.
Is a combination of sample something you would consider, or
Wouldn't
it
hurt.
becomes redundant?
Like, yeah, the more opportunities that there are to, you know, get at it, the better. I mean, yeah, the more, a lot of people don't have the time to do that, but yeah, if it's a horse that, you know, you wanna, and again, it's all about the stage, you know, the staging. We don't, you know, initial diagnosis is one thing, trying to determine silent shedders is a whole other thing.
Yeah, now I'm gonna follow up on this question on the silent channel since you brought it upon yourself. From a practical standpoint, since most veterinarians don't have the luxury to have an endoscope, what would be a protocol to, let's say, screen a horse that comes to the property? There's no history of strangles before, but you know, everybody's paranoid, don't want to take a chance. That barn experienced an outbreak. They want horses that come in that are clean as a whistle. So screening horses either at the end of a disease outbreak or random horse, not random horse, but you know, from a biosecurity standpoint, you want to screen a horse, be sure it's clean. You have no access to an endoscope. Can you run me through what you would do, the frequency, and what testing you would require, knowing that this is, you know, Rob's opinion to some extent?
Well, yeah, I mean, the books, I mean, they talk about the book, which is a consensus statement. You know, they say 3 negative samples, and, you know, that's kind of what the consensus is, you know. So basically 3 nasal pharyngeal washes or swabs is what they say 7 days apart. So 0, 7, and 14 days. The other thing that's sort of been widely accepted, so that's a situation you don't have a scope, you can't get in the guttural pouch. I'm very intrigued by, not to totally go down a rabbit hole here, but on Amazon you can get these plumber scopes, and they're about $29. You can't direct them very well, but I have a colleague who puts them in a protective tube sleeve, and he's been able to get into the pouch. They have a plastic lens, but the quality of the image is unbelievable. And so I guess what I would do, because I'm totally out of practice, is I would get one of these things if I didn't have a scope for 29 bucks, and I would try to, at least you're going to be able to visualize getting into the guttural pouch. Because again, great to be able to visualize the guttural pouch, and you can do these with these plumbers cameras or whatever they refer to them as, and you can get some decent pictures. You can't deal with fogging. There's all sorts of things. They're much more difficult to disinfect because of the plastic lens. You know, there's a whole lot of problems with it, but people have been very comfortable with flushing a guttural pouch, submitting that for PCR on a one-time basis and saying you're golden, or flushing each pouch. So, and again, the industry sort of accepted that as being okay in the face of the 3 negative samples using a wash. But I guess that's what I would do, is try to figure out how you could get that done, because it's typical. You know, you've got somebody bringing a horse into a facility that hasn't had strangles. They want to determine whether that horse is at risk. And so my recommendations are flush the pouch, flush both pouches, submit it for PCR. If it's negative, PCR is so sensitive compared to culture that you're golden. And you can, and to my knowledge, nobody's really been burned by doing guttural pouch washes and using that kind of protocol. But that's how I would handle it.
So just to clarify, one single guttural pouch lavage combined right and left, or 3 nasopharyngeal washes would be they're not similar, but it would be acceptable. Let's call it acceptable.
And this came from the Animal Health Trust did a very good job. And actually on my presentation, I sort of got a flow chart and they, basically said that you have a 95% chance that this horse is not potential. And that's kind of the thing that I've thrown around from a percentage standpoint.
So a few short little question. Can you repeat the volume that you're using for your wash?
About 50 cc.
50, 50. Okay.
Yeah.
And how do you disinfect the equipment? If you go from horse to horse?
Yeah, Strep equi is very easy to kill with most disinfectants. Remember that the chlorine disinfectants are very diminished in the presence of organic matter, so kind of keep that in mind. So one of the, I really like the highly potentiated hydrogen peroxide products. Their contact time is very short. And so those are the kind of things that I would use because you're going to, if it can kill TB in a minute or a half or whatever, it's going to kill Strep equi in short order, and use that for lip chains and try to, like as you pointed out, as much disposable equipment so you don't have to deal with that. Use a separate set of exam gloves, ditch those, and try to keep that in mind because you'll have a mess on your hands if you wash or swab a bunch of horses and then everybody's positive and it was just cross contamination.
All right, gentlemen, I'm gonna just give you the time, so maybe we can move on to the next topic after this question. And then any of the questions that we're missing in the chat, this is great because we want to have follow-up sessions after this.
Yeah, so I'm gonna move on. There's other few questions. I just want to report an anonymous attendee. They use boot covers to prevent horses from sneezing. They're not preventing them from sneezing, but actually preventing the aerosolization of the fluid. It's a great idea. They have, that wide. You can move them over, put it almost the entire head in there.
Cool. Great
So
idea.
I'm gonna move to the less controversial topic of diagnostic. And I want to say, I grew up, went to vet school where PCR were just coming up, and I've really embraced PCR, and I realized the limitation it has. What I want to say with that is that culture still has a place. Culture is the techniques that, for many decades was used. It has low cost. It's highly sensitive, but not as sensitive as PCR. If you bought into the culture, you have to keep in mind that a negative culture, we used to look at culture as a gold standard. So if it's negative, it's not there. If it cannot grow, it's not there. If it's not there, you don't have to worry about it because there's nothing contagious on that plate. That is not necessarily true. We have to consider that this is all a numbers game. Culture, any culture, viral culture, bacterial culture, depend on the organism, but also depends on the number. In the early and late stages of a disease, when the numbers are small, the organism may not necessarily grow. If the plate is overgrown with other streptococcal organisms, strep zoo, the small numbers of colony of strep equi may be missed. And on top of that, some of these horses will be pre-treated before you take the biological sample. So you may have biological inhibitor of growth. So look at these organisms. They may be there. They may just be stunted. That's not a bacteriological term, but imagine, they're just not flourishing well, but they're still viable. So there's a difference between what we consider viability, organism is truly contagious, and capability to culture and expand on a plate. There's no doubt that, in the past probably 2 decades, PCR has supplanted culture. There's many reasons. It's faster, it's more sensitive, specific, you got quick turnaround time. And generally another advantage is if you test for strep equi, you're going to test for other respiratory pathogens. You can have that panel strategy. Because it's so highly sensitive, if you look at the table, I just listed a few studies that look at the detection rate between culture and PCR, and you can see that PCR, will detect at a greater rate strep equi, and which is great because now you not only have a red flag, you get 2 red flags. So you're going to isolate, potentially seclude more horses. But the question is always, well, hold on. What does a positive PCR result mean? A positive PCR result means that there is the presence of the target gene. It doesn't tell you what the organism is doing. And there's always this big debate. If you can culture it, it's expanding, it's viable. If it's detected, it detected a genome, you don't know if that organism is turned on or off. You don't know if it's just partial DNA, denaturated DNA. You don't really know what that organism is doing. And I get frustrated with situations like that. So in the past 10 years, we have looked at molecular surrogate for viability. And there's different ways you can look at it. Numbers. Most infectious diseases are numbers game. The bigger the number, the more likely the organism is viable. That said, we will find culture negative and PCR positive results where the numbers are low. And we know from experience that some of these results, if they are neglected, even if the signal is weak, can still lead to transmission. We've also looked at messenger RNA transcript with the idea that if messenger RNA is there, the organism is transcribing, is likely viable. Unfortunately, messenger RNA will degrade rapidly. And the latest approach that we looked at, although it's not practical, is to do a similar approach to what we do with Salmonella. So we do a pre-incubation step, 24-hour pre-incubation step in an enrichment broth, and then we look at the signal before and after. If the signal gets stronger, we know that the organism is replicating. But still, issue. My take-home message with PCR is even a little bit positive should be considered as a red flag. And so the question is always, well, where's the limit? There was a very interesting question today on the ACBM listserv about CT values. So put a number in it, put a threshold, and I would caution anybody to put a threshold on any result, mostly because some of these samples are diluted, so they're washes. So your signal is going to be weaker no matter what, because now you got 50 milliliters of saline rather than a big juicy swab. But we also know that small number of target gene can be associated with viability. So anything that is 40 is negative. Anything that is below 40 will be considered positive, and in doubt needs to be repeated. I'm just going to expand a little bit on serology. I know there was a question on serology, and I do apologize if we don't address your question, if they don't necessarily apply to the topic we are on. But as Eric said, we'll get to all the questions sooner or later, definitely before Christmas. So if you look at serology, the limitation with serology, the SEM test that we have here in the United States, unfortunately, we don't have some of the more advanced tests. There's always the limitation of these tests that they cannot differentiate between a vaccinated and an animal that has acquired antibodies through natural infection. So the combined antigen ANC indirect ELISA that is available in Europe that would potentially help in certain circumstances is not available. So how can we use serology? We can use serology to document a recent infection. If you have an acute and convalescent serum sample that's taken 10 days apart and you have a rise in antibody titers, that's great. The way we generally use the SEM titers to support diagnosis for which we can't get to the organism, we can culture or we cannot detect it via PCR. Purpura hemorrhagica, high titer, 12,000 and above, highly indicative of a systemic disease. You would have to put together your blood work, maybe skin biopsy to support that. Internal diseases, you can get to the abscess, to the organ-related infection. If the titer is very, very high, 12,000 and above, you have to consider metastatic infection. And nice work that came out of Penn, Dr. Ashley Barr, looking at risk factor of horses that have experienced an recent infection within a year that potentially carry high titers against strep equi and the likelihood of developing purpura hemorrhagica. So the way we we like to deal with these horses is run a titer, and the titer is high, 3,200 and above, and the horse has experienced a strep equi infection within a year, that horse should not be vaccinated. However, as I have on this slide, we cannot use the strep equi, the SAM antibody test, to screen animal entering a herd. We can't run it on and say, okay, well, this one needs to be followed up with a pouch, lavage, and testing. So we can identify carrier status like you're more likely to be able to do with the combined antigen ANC indirect ELISA, and we cannot assess the protection status based on an antibody titer. Rob, it's on you.
All right. Well, and there's one thing I just wanted to mention. There's a serologic test available in the EU that is talked about. You'll find it on the web. It's in the consensus statement, and it was developed in the face of not having any vaccines available, and that's why it doesn't apply. It's not available in the United States as of yet, but it's basically a serologic test that can predict recent infection and actually guttural pouch disease, and so it's a potential tool to be able to screen horses serologically, that have guttural pouch disease. So, question, Dr. Pasterla, if we suspect, what other sort of diagnostic testing would be warranted if you expect sort of myositis complications to strep equi? What can you quickly kind of get us up to speed on this?
So if you have, post-natural infection or post-vaccination, we see occasionally a horse that develops an acute myopathy, you'll have your initial blood work, your biochemical panel, elevation of liver, and elevation of muscle enzyme. You'll have, clinical presentation. So you have to put the two together, but you may be, a few days, a few weeks, as different forms of myopathy. So the final diagnosis will be histology, and histology is going to be essential. Unfortunately, most of these immune-mediated myopathy required, rapid intervention with corticosteroids. So you can't wait generally until you have histological confirmation. So you have to put together the history, and sometimes it's unknown. You got to put the clinical signs, other rule outs, genetic predisposition, and some of these genetic predisposition can actually make horses more susceptible to develop these, immune-mediated conditions secondary to not just strep equi infection. We see him, after viral infection as well.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Can we expect a horse with guttural pouch disease to have a high serologic SEM titer?
Not with the test that we use. In other words, yes and no. I mean, the titer using the strep equi and protein ELISA does not allow you to support carrier stage or rule out carrier stage. Nor does it for guttural pouch empyema. I would say guttural pouch empyema, you would have enough clinical evidence to support it. So we are away from the serology. The guttural pouch empyema would be going back to your biological sample. The deeper, the better. Guttural pouch lavage, if possible. Swabs or washes. Now, I want to say something that I'm going to regret, okay? But that's fine. I have 10 years before I retire, so be nice to me. So I'm frugal. I'm very frugal. I promote PCR. So, and the last thing I want to do is you got to test everything. You got to collect all these samples and you got to test everything. Put the math together. 3 biological sample collection by veterinarian, 3 shipments, and 3 tests. What are we talking about? We are over $1,000 and we haven't done much. Am I right? Yep. Bear with me. It's beaucoup money, okay? So here's a strategy that and I have no science to back it up. I just rely on the fact that it's PCR. It's a biological sample that degrades slowly, and it's targeting genomic DNA and not RNA. If you take a biological sample today and you keep it, put it in a fridge, freeze it if you want. You take another one in a week, do the same. You take the third one on your third week, although I question the 1 week interval. When the salmonella, 5 culture, we're not waiting 1 day. Sometimes we wait just a few hours. It's fecal piles. So if you take 3 samples that you have stored, you pull them together, you ship them, so you have 1 shipment and you have 1 analysis. As long as you put the same volume, you can put 1 cc in the first sample, the second and the third sample. That's 1 biological sample that is tested. That's 1 test. If it's negative, it's a dilution 1 to 3. That horse is good to go, knowing the sensitivity. If it's positive, it doesn't really matter which one was positive. Am I right? You're back. It's the monopoly. You're back to prison. You're starting fresh. Yep. So I'm just saying there are ways to beat the system a little bit, and it's the same with pooling sample. Hate to do that, but it works.
Yep. No, very good point. I think we're going to have to move on. Eric?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. It's time. Yeah, we're running out of time. Great questions, and we're not ignoring you in the Q&A. Hopefully, we'll be able to get to these vaccine questions and stuff like that here with my portion. So, managing outbreaks. Next slide. There we go.
Sorry, I liked my slide.
All right, there we go.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah, really, it sounds really simple, but preventing spread of strep equi to other horses, that's really the goal. Obviously, if we're able to contain the infection to a barn or an area, trying to keep areas clean and prevent cross infection. Cohorting is pretty common. The consensus statement does a nice job, and I'm sure you've seen the red, amber, and green approach to trying to categorize horses in different stages. Those horses that are actively infected, those horses that have been exposed but not infected, and then those horses that have not been exposed and are fine. And then, the challenge with this disease, and there was a question in the chat about how long horses would shed. They can shed for years. And if they've got guttural pouch chondroids, they can intermittently shed for periods of time. There's some great, examples of horses, ponies, especially in the UK, that, they documented when the horse had strangles and had an issue, and 12 years later, they decide to look in the guttural pouch and they just chuck full of chondroids, and those are going to intermittently contaminate water sources and that type of thing. Vaccination, we're not going to spend a lot of time on. There's 2 vaccines available in the United States. There's the extract vaccine that Boehringer Ingelheim makes, and then there's the modified live intranasal vaccine that from Zoetis. The one thing people ask, how good are the vaccines? The one thing we got to keep in mind, and this is in the consensus statement, is that only 75% of the horses that recover from active disease have any long-standing immunity. So we have 25% of the population that is susceptible. And so that's something to keep in mind. And so it begs the question, can we expect a vaccine to be better than being infected and getting sick? And that may be kind of difficult. There's a new vaccine available in Europe called Strangles. It's been on the market for a short period of time. It's going to be very interesting to see how that performs in the field. They've been developing it for a long time, and we'll sort of leave it at that. The other thing one last thing on vaccination is and this is spelled out in the consensus statement, it is contraindicated to vaccinate a horse that has a greater than 1 to 1600 titer. And so that's kind of what we preach. And somebody had asked a question about how do you handle horses with high SEM titers. and in a population. Well, A, they don't need to be vaccinated, and B, if it's really, really high, you may want to explore other issues like metastatic disease somehow. All right, next slide, please. So this was the epiphany slides that I saw 20 years ago, actually in Scotland at one of these Havemeyers. The one on the left, if you can see that bulge, that is the guttural pouch that is being visualized, and that's the retropharyngeal lymph node in the process of exploding in the guttural pouch. And so I guess for me, and I thought I did a good job with anatomy, but anytime you have retropharyngeal lymph node involvement, you have guttural pouch disease. I mean, that's the path of least resistance. And that's where really getting a good history and paying attention to how these outbreaks unfold, it's very difficult to get useful information. But if you can have people pay attention, it'll identify the horses that you ought to suspect, and rather than having to go crazy and wash and examine all these horses, hit the high target or the high value target horses first and try to reduce the bioburden in the population, because this is not necessarily an inexpensive process. Next slide, please. And this is an example, the histopath on the lower right, that is the retropharyngeal lymph node, and you can see, and that's the guttural pouch above. And not to belabor the point, but these chondroids, they infiltrate, they turn into hard stuff that's very difficult to flush out of the pouch. And so they can just be a source every time the horse drops his head, takes a drink. They can be a big source of environmental. And you can see where the intermittent nature of shedding out the nose can occur. Next slide, please. And just a real quick, and I'm sorry we don't have more time, but this is I got a phone call in January from a veterinarian in the Midwest, and he was very frustrated. It was a closed herd, show horses. It was wintertime. They had some breeding going on, and not a lot of showing going on in the upper Midwest. And so first case was in the show horses. Owners freaking out because show season's coming up, and it's like, man, we gotta deal with this. And this veterinarian did what the horse owner wanted to do and went in and started testing, and it turned out being almost a whack-a-mole type thing, that there was new cases every few days, and the big challenge there was A, not doing a good job with biosecurity and trying to eliminate potential sources of contamination, so you could shut the outbreak down. But understanding that as horses recover, they're going to naturally, and let's say they don't have guttural pouch involvement, they're going to shed the organism. If you do washes on these horses in a week or 2 weeks, you're going to have a bunch of positives, and they don't have any biologic significance. If you waited 3 or 4 weeks, those horses would be negative. And so that's what really sort of complicates things by jumping the gun. And I totally get it. That's okay. You can go, Nicola. I totally get it, because the owner's breathing down your neck, and we've just got to get our wits about us, because if you jump in there, I've babysat some of these things, and that's probably the biggest mistake people make, is just allowing the after no new clinical cases, you need to wait a minimum of 3 weeks before you start going and doing diagnostic testing to determine, do you have these healthy appearing carriers in the population. So last slide. History is so important. I mean, you can do yourself huge favors by getting a really good history of how this thing unfolded, and get a little sense for what the cleanliness, biosecurity, how much horse back and forth is going. Are they doing a good job of taking, keeping their brood mares, isolated in one area, and your younger horses in another, and your performance horses in another. Many of these facilities don't have that luxury. Lots of horses on a small postage stamp of real estate can make be very difficult. Biosecurity, and again, I know I sound like a broken record, but I thought water source is a huge thing, and little things like that a lot of people have. Everybody thought water tank at the end of the arena was a good place, and every horse sticks their head in there and doing a good job of emptying those and disinfecting those can help you a lot. And just like with all these infectious diseases, it's a lot to get people to temp twice a day. But theoretically, if you believe what the gurus tell us, that 24 to 48 hours it takes after a fever for horses to shed this organism, theoretically, if you did a really good job of temping once and preferably twice a day, you could stop any fevers, get them out of there, and you should be able to stop this thing. Again, you've got ongoing contamination with other sources. That's not the case. But as far as being able to spread this disease through active cases, very, very good tool. Again, wait 3 weeks before you jump in to try to determine these healthy appearing carriers. You remember, it's all about the guttural pouch. If you're looking at long-term and how to eliminate the bioburden in a population, you've got to deal with guttural pouch disease. And then somebody gave me this tip, and they said, there's certain farms that have it on an annual basis. And it's very overwhelming to say, how in the heck are we going to change our reputation and try to eliminate this? And if you've got it every year and you have a long-standing population, somebody suggested, and I think it makes sense to focus on those longer-term residents that have been around as long as the disease has been around. And so I'll open it up. I'm not sure how much time we have left. We have 0 time, so.
I have to ask 2 questions, make justice to the topic. So the first one is, if you have a horse that experienced strangle last year, and let's say, has a titer that is less than 3,200, and you decide to vaccinate, would you follow, and the horse hasn't been vaccinated before, would you give 1 vaccine, or would you give the full manufacturer's recommendation, which is 2 vaccines, 3 weeks apart?
I think if you in fact ran the titer, so you knew the horse that had been exposed, chances are, how can I say this? Not following the label would potentially be, be okay. I mean, the StrepVax label is the 3-dose series, and that's intended for naive animals, obviously. And we don't have any data to show what 1 or 2 doses does. But if you really want to know, wait 3 weeks and do another SEM titer, and that'll tell you exactly where you are. But I've got a hyper responder in my backyard. He's 27 years old. I vaccinated him 23 years ago, and he got a titer greater than 1 to 12,500. And I check him periodically, and he's really high up there. And he's in a closed little herd with 4 horses in the middle of nowhere, Montana. So it's amazing. They tell us that antibodies are supposed to decay over time, but there's a case where this particular horse, I'd be afraid to vaccinate that horse from a per standpoint.
How long does strep equi survive in the environment? Do we have to be worried about environment? I'm not talking water.
Yeah, water is, and it's interesting because there's some new information. We used to say that, man, you get strep on your place, it gets in the soil, you are screwed. There's nothing you can do about it. And what we've learned in soil, especially, is the soil organisms do a pretty good job of chewing it up in like 1 to 3 days. We do have to worry about, water situations. Especially heaters are great at keeping water from freezing, but it can be up to 3 to 6 weeks in water sources. So that's why I think that's something that we ought to remind our clients we really need to address.
And then the last question is, what do you use to disinfect water tanks? What would you recommend?
Emptying them. Most people use, they have these, pretty much anything will work, whether it's Nolvasan or it's one of these potentiated hydrogen peroxide products. But getting the scum, and the biomass off of that is probably the most important. With soap, and you can do a lot with just soap and water and cleaning it out and refilling it.
Excellent. Eric, you want to take over?
Yeah. No, yeah. I know time goes by quickly when you're having fun. But no, thank you both for presenting today, and I thank you the audience for all the questions. We're going to look over the questions that we missed as well to see if we have any other topics that we can cover. Likewise, in the audience, feel free to reach out to us, Dr. Pasterla, Dr. Keen directly. If there's any topics that you'd like us to cover in the future, Fluxergy again is ready to continue sponsoring education. Also, another big shout out to the charity Dr. Keen is representing, the Breakaway Youth Program. Yeah, again, thanks again for joining during dinner time, everybody. And yeah, see you next time.